and the audience. First of all, I'd like to apologize in advance for any technical problems we may encounter. Hopefully everything will run smoothly, but of course we never know. In more practical terms, after the individual presentations, we'll have a general Q&A. And the way this works is you can put your questions into a Q&A chat box that hopefully you can find on your Zoom screen. You can put these questions into this chat box throughout the presentations. And then once we get to the Q&A, I will select a few of those questions that then the individual panelists will answer. I'd also like to remember you that you can tweet about the event, you can engage in the debate about what we discuss. If you do so, please use the hashtag #GlobalShocks. And finally, just to remind everyone that the panel's being live streamed, as of course those who are on YouTube have noticed already. Well, hopefully this is all clear. Let's start then, without further ado, with the individual presentations. And we'll start the presentations with an interesting talk by Dr. Duraid Jalili. He's a lecturer in the Department of Defense Studies. He's an expert in defense academies, and if you've ever wondered what the Defense Studies Department does at the Joint Service Command and Staff College in Shrewsbury, he is the person to ask. Duraid, please.
Thank you very much, Ben. Hi everyone, pleasure to be here. In line with the sort of theme of this session, I'm going to be giving a 5-minute insight into the ways in which executive level security and defense colleges can influence international responses to global crises, such as the coronavirus pandemic. Now, first things first, what exactly is an executive level security and defense college? Well, this is just one possible descriptive term for a range of institutions that some of you may know of as national defense colleges or institutions for higher defense studies. Well-known examples of these that you may have heard of are the NATO Defense College, the Royal College of Defense Studies here in the UK, and the National War College in the US. Now, I've put some of the key characteristics of these colleges up on the screen. Hopefully you can see that. But in summary, these are government-run institutions that provide education focused on international affairs, critical thinking, leadership skills, policy formulation, and planning. Their student demographic is a generally diverse cohort of hand-picked security and defense officials who are seen to be prospective candidates for leadership roles at the highest levels of government. So chiefs of defense staff, heads of the Foreign Office, there are even a few sort of monarchs sprinkled in and around there. There exist currently around 90 of these colleges and courses worldwide. That includes ones for nations, as well as ones for wider security communities such as NATO, the Organization of American States, and so forth. Now, in addition to these formative educational goals, the colleges hope to achieve a number of strategic objectives, both at the national and international level. This list here gives a general idea of the objectives that are most commonly discussed or most prominently featured in historical and contemporary literature on the subject. Now, obviously, to a certain extent, all of these objectives could theoretically help to influence international responses to global crises, such as COVID. Unfortunately, in understanding the degree to which they generate positive results, scholarship up until recently has been limited by a lack of substantive empirical evidence. Now, for the most part, scholars and practitioners have tended to focus on measuring effectiveness based on two key aspects. Firstly, the promotion rates of alumni, and that's based on the assumption that seniority is a kind of by proxy indicator of influence and impact. And secondly, anecdotal examples in which informal and formal collaboration between alumni have resulted in notable positive outcomes. So this isn't to say that these anecdotal examples aren't important or that they aren't relevant. Indeed, for example, coordination between Australian, New Zealander, and Japanese alumni of the National Institute of Defence Studies in Japan is seen to have increased the rapidity and the effectiveness of the international response to the 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami. Many of these types of anecdotal examples often align with wider scholarly research, for example, on the national security benefits that can be achieved through discrete agreements and bargaining between elites. And there's a particularly relevant link between a recent report by the UK Stabilisation Organisation. So over the last couple of decades, however, in order to move away from this more anecdotal means of evidencing impact, scholars have been working towards creating more substantive, quantitative, and qualitative data sets and analyses on the impact that such colleges can have on global security and the underlying factors that catalyze insecurity. Now, these studies have resulted in some valuable insights. I'll just go through just a few of these. So Atkinson demonstrates that such colleges can help to decrease the propensity of countries to repress citizens' basic freedoms, and they can also help to enhance democratization. Now, this latter factor may lead to increased international cooperation, which obviously helps in dealing with global crises such as COVID-19, and that's based on the fact that there is a statistical link between increased international cooperation between democratic states. Amongst its findings, my own PhD data indicates that colleges may significantly influence students' perspectives on the value of international and civil military cooperation, thus hopefully increasing the likelihood that such individuals will seek to share resources and lessons learned and coordinate strategies throughout a crisis. And there's further data as well that demonstrates that such colleges can catalyze self-reflection and influence students' beliefs on factors that will then influence their responses to a global crisis. So I've put a few here. So we can influence the beliefs of these future senior leaders on issues of human rights within their countries, the types of strategies required to maintain security, the role of the military, particularly in supporting a democratic state, as it were, rather than, you know, hopefully not creating any military coups, and even their personal identity and value systems. Now, unfortunately, despite these studies, there exists a significant need for further research, including the generation of new data sets, the application of new methodologies, particularly, I would argue, social network analysis and participatory action research, and the verification of findings from historical studies. So taking that anecdotal data and seeing if we can verify that in order to demonstrate a longevity of historical impact. So why is it important that we get this data? Well, there are two key reasons. Firstly, most importantly, for every study that proposes there to be a potential link between strategic level education and the enhancement of security practices, there's another study which proposes there to be a link between such education and issues of corruption, human rights failures, and political infighting. Now, these studies all possess the same weaknesses in terms of the use of anecdotal data and issues of bias. So unless scholars are able to increase the amount of methodologically rigorous analyses and empirically substantive data sets available on both sides, then we won't be able to sort of pin down the truth of these potential after effects. And secondly, although it hasn't been quantified yet, research hints at the potential that the cost-benefit ratio of these programs, these types of educational exchange programs in terms of enhancing security and influence, is very significant. Despite this, such programs receive relatively low funding as a proportion of overall military spending, measuring the cost-benefit ratio would enable us to demonstrate that there may be a significant value in increasing the size, scope, and funding of these educational programs in comparison to other areas of security spending. So I'll leave it at that and hand over to Ben again. And I'm looking forward to hopefully answering any questions that you might have at the end of the session.
Right. Duraid, thank you very much. A fascinating talk, and I'm sure we'll get a lot of questions about this. It's certainly an area we don't know a lot about, and you have helped us to understand it better. Next, I'd like to welcome Amelia Morgan, a PhD student in the School of Security Studies. Amelia is a specialist in all aspects of nuclear diplomacy, and we are really lucky today that we can benefit from her in-depth knowledge in that area. Amelia, please.
Thank you, Ben. Thanks for inviting me today. So I'm Amelia. I work within the Centre for Science and Security Studies at King's, and we conduct research across the nuclear landscape to include verification, nuclear security, non-proliferation, disarmament, and deterrence. And one of our main areas is policy relevant research around nuclear diplomacy. So there's been a regrettable lack of middle ground balanced approaches to questions of disarmament and deterrence in recent years, which has stifled opportunities for practical progress. One of our main goals is to bring together communities that don't always agree with each other and to offer a forum for constructive dialogue. So we don't conduct quantitative studies or run regressions. It's very much a human approach where we build a network of decision makers, experts, and through interviews and workshops, explore opportunities for common ground. So for example, CSSS alongside the European Leadership Network were the NGO facilitators of the P5 meetings in February. And the P5 process, for those who don't know, is a forum for dialogue between the 5 NPT nuclear weapon states. So I have the easy task of summarizing the current state of nuclear diplomacy in 7 minutes. So I'll just focus on 3 salient trends that we've witnessed over the last few years, and then I'll explain how COVID might impact them. My bottom line up front is that the coronavirus is unlikely to fundamentally change the broader contours of the nuclear order, but it will exacerbate current challenges. So what were some of the main trends pre-COVID? Well, first, there was a general consensus that nuclear risks are rising and need to be reduced. So this is partly a result of heightened tensions between geopolitical rivals. The salience of nuclear weapons in national doctrine and strategy has increased. New and emerging powers, for example, North Korea, and also, the potential applications and impact of new and emerging technologies. And combined, these factors all increase the risk of nuclear use, either through misperception or miscalculation, and potentially undermine long-term non-proliferation efforts. Positively, various multilateral initiatives exploring the opportunities for risk reduction are currently underway, and include participation by nuclear possessors, non-nuclear weapon states, NATO states, and NGOs. So for example, there are initiatives led by Germany, the Netherlands, the United States, and Sweden. Second main trend is that the traditional mechanisms for trying to manage nuclear risk are breaking down. So the most obvious example is arms control. The US has withdrawn from several important arms control agreements over the last few years, including the INF Treaty, the JCPOA, and most recently, Open Skies. And now only one treaty is currently in effect, which limits the world's 2 largest nuclear arsenals, New START, which will expire in 2021 and shows few prospects of being extended. There are several factors at play here, which maybe we can explore in Q&A, Trump retrenchment, Russian non-compliance, and US insistence that China be involved in any future arms control agreement. The third trend is not new, but it's one that has contributed to further polarization in recent years. And this is diverging approaches on how to proceed with nuclear disarmament. And there's a fundamental disconnect between those who believe that the way to go is through gradual reductions versus those who think nuclear risks are way too high and more transformative moves towards zero are necessary. And this frustration over the lack of disarmament led to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which opened for signature in 2017. And this was a culminated efforts of civil society and several non-nuclear weapon states. And this has created quite a divide between nuclear weapon states and TPNW supporters. The nuclear weapon states cite various concerns over the ban treaty, be they legal, political, impact on the NPT, and the sufficiency of the verification measures within the treaty. So what challenges does COVID pose to all of this? The most obvious is that most forums for dialogue, both multilateral and bilateral, have been postponed. State activities, resources, and attention are likely to be dominated by COVID for the foreseeable future. This poses additional barriers to sustaining dialogue and engagement on nuclear issues, both bilaterally and multilaterally. Second, as we've already seen, COVID has heightened tensions between major powers, particularly the United States and China. So one of the main questions going forward will be, how do you prevent these rising tensions bleeding into cooperation and progress on nuclear issues, particularly at a time when the US seeks to establish a new arms control architecture with Russia and China? And lastly, COVID might serve to amplify existing polarization on nuclear disarmament. The poor national and international response to the virus reinforces existing concerns about the global implications of nuclear use and demonstrates a lack of coordinated responses to a global crisis. This raises questions about our preparedness and our capacity to respond to nuclear use. It may also lead to renewed calls for disarmament that were perhaps more vigorous than before, and those states already under pressure, particularly NATO states and allies and partners, may come under increasing pressure, particularly at a time when spending priorities will be reevaluated. It may also force a fundamental rethink of basic principles, how to ensure public security. Are nuclear weapons the best means by which to do that? And that's a particularly difficult argument to make in the current crisis. So to close, is it all doom and gloom, or is there something positive we can take from the current crisis? While COVID has laid bare the inadequacies of global cooperative responses to global threats, in the nuclear sphere, this ultimately reinforces the urgent need for dialogue and cooperation on nuclear risks, and is an opportunity to reevaluate existing priorities, to reassess our global preparedness for nuclear use and the measures we need to be taking to prevent it. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, Amelia, thank you very much, and thank you very much for finishing on a positive note. That is certainly welcome at this time of crisis. Our next panelist is, as you can see already in the video, Dr. Ben Nemeth, a teaching fellow in the Defense Studies Department, who works on European defense cooperation, and whose presentation is, I believe, based on his forthcoming book.
Yes.
Ben, please.
Thank you very much. So yes, I am going to talk about the puzzles of a successful defense cooperation in Europe in general. And just let's share my screen with you to show my presentation. So yes, so basically the puzzles of a successful defense cooperation, and basically my title of my presentation is the same as my forthcoming book, as Ben mentioned, How to Achieve Defense Cooperation in Europe. And I'm going to talk about some of the insights of this book in the next couple of minutes. But first, let's see how we understand defense cooperation. So what is this? Multinational defense cooperation, or in short, MDC, is any arrangement where two or more nations work together to enhance military capabilities. And these can be, for instance, multinational units, or common procurement of certain platforms of different countries, or just a framework that helps sharing best practices and lessons learned through joint training, common training between countries, or education or exercises. But I would like to point out what an MDC is not. So an MDC is basically is not, it has to be permanent. So a one-off military exercise cannot be an MDC. And also MDC is not cooperation, multinational cooperation in operations. So it is capability development that is happening before the operations. And why is it important? So the density, as you can see in the second bullet point, the density and interconnectedness of military cooperation in Europe is unprecedented, both in historical terms and also geographically. It means that basically we have never seen such kind of deep and wide defense cooperation between European countries in the history like we have now, and it has never happened before in any other areas either. We have hundreds of defense cooperative initiatives and frameworks and processes in Europe, also on bilateral level, on the EU-NATO level, and between these two levels, we call them unilateral level when small groupings are cooperating together. And basically tens of thousands European military personnel are participating in these different MDCs every year, and tens of billions of euros are spent, for instance, on different development, capability development projects, which can be R&D or developing new platforms as well. However, we focus too much on the regional level, on the EU-NATO dynamics, usually. And actually, the most relevant processes are happening on the sub-regional level, in unilateral and bilateral cooperations. Basically, here is where the cooperation is happening in practice. And I show you how the dynamics between these different levels are going on. So we can see that here are the three levels of defense cooperation in Europe: bilateral, unilateral, and NATO and EU level. And the different actors can upload and download policies, initiatives, ideas, and cooperative efforts between these levels. I tell you one of the examples. For instance, on the bilateral level, France and the UK decided that a European security and defense policy would be a good idea. They decided it in 1998 and made an agreement on that in San Malo. And they convinced other EU countries about the usefulness of this idea. Basically, they uploaded this idea to the EU level, and it means that that we have now European security and defense policy, which we call CSDP, Common Security Defense Policy at the moment. However, a couple of years later, in 2004, EU countries decided that it would be a good idea to create battalion-sized force packages, EU battle groups, and countries downloaded it to the unilateral level, and several countries are created these force packages, and also bilaterally countries created this. It shows how the dynamics go on. We can see this dynamic between NATO initiatives as well, but many unilateral and bilateral level cooperation exist outside any NATO and EU cooperative frameworks as well. So let's see how the puzzle of defense cooperation is going on. So for creating a new defense cooperation in Europe, a new MDC, we need three structure and two situational factors. The structural factors are basically institutions, solid and long-standing relationships, trends, perceptions that had been developed for a relatively long period of time. They don't change often. And also the situational factors reflect on the political and economic environment, personal relationships that might change relatively quickly. So basically the structural factors that are the enabling factors for defense cooperation while situational factors are those ones that trigger the cooperation. The structural factor is, for instance, the European security community, that we, in the EU and NATO, among EU and NATO members, we understand security the same way, and we don't want to wage war against each other. It is a huge enabling factor. Without it, the trust would not be there for such a wide and deep defense cooperation that we have today. Defense budgets are important. I mean, the perception about the defense budget is important. Basically, militaries perceive that they don't have enough money to have the capabilities they want to have, and it is a big push for them to cooperate with each other. Also, previous MDCs are also important because although politicians usually sell a new MDC as it is a totally new and historic MDC oftentimes, but if we look below the surface, we can see that MDCs are usually built on previous ones, or they are just recycling or relabeling themselves. So the evolution is mostly incremental and not revolutionary. So these are the enabling structural elements, and the situational one that triggers the cooperation. Strong leadership and chemistry is important here between different leaders. So at the end of the day, we need people who create this cooperation, and they have to like each other, because without it, usually people don't like to cooperate and don't like to work together. So we can see that in every cooperation on relatively high level, there are 2 or 3 leaders. It can be head of state or defense policy directors or ministers who like each other and want to cooperate. Supportive political milieu is also important, because if there is not wider political support for the cooperation would end up in a vacuum. And now I just would like to show you briefly a figure how these puzzles, factors of defense cooperation work together. I will not have the time to explain them because I'm going to run out of time. But basically, the umbrella is the European security community, and inside the European security community, there are options, and there are different options that might be used by the different militaries. But if you have any questions in this regard, I am happy to answer it during the Q&A. So thank you very much. That's from me.
Thanks. Thank you very much. I think that was a very insightful presentation, and I can see in the chat that it has already triggered questions for you. But before we have the Q&A, we still have 2 more presentations. The first one is by Sophia Besch, who joins us today from Berlin. For those who don't know Sophia, she's a senior research fellow at the Center for European Reform, where she's a leading voice on European foreign and security policies. And what is perhaps less known is that she's also a PhD student at King's. So Sophia, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you, Ben, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be able to speak to you today. I've put together a brief outline of my presentation on this slide here to hopefully make it easier to follow along. Ben asked me to speak about the European Commission in Defense Industrial Policy. And so first, let me clarify what that refers to. The EU has proposed a range of defense initiatives in the last couple of years, including perhaps most widely known PESCO. The defense activism of 2016-2017 has died down a little bit now, but one tangible outcome is that there will now likely be a budget line for defense R&D for the first time in the EU's history, the so-called European Defense Fund, managed by the first ever Commission Director General for Defense Industry and Space. Now, I would argue that this is an interesting development, first, because it breaks with a long-standing taboo that EU budget money should not be spent on non-civilian projects. And second, because it signals a possible shift from intergovernmental cooperation mechanisms to more supranational authority over the EU's defense market. Now, there's an obvious COVID angle here, and that is the money. The Defense Fund is trying to remedy the insufficient national level spending on R&D, research and technology, as a percentage of defense spending has been steadily decreasing in the EU since 2006. And in the economic crisis triggered by COVID that we can expect further cuts to national defense budgets. Just as a comparison, in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, total defense spending dropped in the following 6 years by about 11%, and the capability gaps that have come out of that still exist. At the same time, in parallel to national budgets, the EU budget line for defense has also already been halved in the latest Corona budget proposal. The defense fund was initially proposed at 13 billion, it will now be at 8 billion over 7 years. Now, of course, that matters, but I would argue that even at 13 billion, with this kind of money, the Commission was never going to reform the EU's defense market or single-handedly incentivize the development of key capabilities. However, I do believe that it's still interesting to examine the Commission's role as the new actor in EU defense industrial policy more closely to see if we can determine trends, if we can see some tensions. So I want to use my remaining time to make 3 points. First, I want to talk briefly about how the Commission's approach has changed from market regulation to financial incentives. Defense has largely been excluded from the EU's market integration dynamics for sovereignty reasons until 2009, when the Commission's first foray into the sector was to try to create an integrated defense market with free movement of defense goods and open public procurement through a regulation package, which member states have persisted to largely ignore since then, again, citing sovereignty concerns. So the European Defence Fund can be considered the carrot to the European Commission's arguably not very effective regulation stick. The idea behind this is that member states might be more inclined to accept EU money than to follow procurement rules in this sensitive sector. This also gives the Commission a leg up on the intergovernmental EDA, the European Defence Agency, which does not have access to this kind of money, famously has a very limited budget. Which brings me to my second point, which is the tension between the economic mandate of the Commission on the one hand and the geopolitical ambition of the fund on the other hand. Now, the European Commission does not actually have a mandate for military and defense policy. It was long considered impossible that defense R&D could be funded under the EU's budget for that reason. A similar attempt by the Commission was thwarted 20 years or so ago. And the workaround that was found this time is that the legal basis for the Commission's activities related to the defense fund is not actually in defense and security policy, but rather relates to economic activities, specifically activities enhancing industrial innovation and competition in the EU. And as a result, the Commission has a sort of imperative to approach defense industrial policy through an economic policy lens, with the objective of strengthening Europe's defense industries. At the same time, however, and here I do see a tension, the defense fund is framed as explicitly geopolitical. It's meant to provide the industrial dimension of the elusive European strategic autonomy. And for some governments and some Commission officials, that entails establishing a defense industry that can single-handedly produce the equipment and the capabilities that European countries require to defend their territory, their interests. This tension between strategic and economic goals is already showing in third country access disputes, which have Washington accusing the Commission and the Defense Fund of protectionism and undermining interoperability among NATO partners. I'll not go into that now, but maybe we can in the Q&A. That makes it necessary to, third point, recall the limits of the Commission's power. Despite all this recent movement, crucial aspects of defense industrial policy, most importantly, authority over conventional arms exports and capability planning, still remain firmly outside the Commission's control. That's the result of rigorous opposition from member states, notably France, to any EU authority over arms exports. The Commission also has no expertise in defense capability planning. That happens nationally and of course NATO. So to conclude, whether the Commission will be able to influence the EU's defense industrial and technological base depends on 4 points maybe. First, political will. The European Commission was able to extend its reach into defense industrial policy because of a surge of political will among member states around 2016 for a range of reasons. That it will need their continued support in order to sustain its influence. It will also depend on the effectiveness of the defense fund's governance. National industry could always refuse to bring a future big ticket capability projects like the next European fighter jet or the next ground combat vehicle under the defense fund if they deem the conditions to access defense fund money too cumbersome, too bureaucratic. There are already some signs for that. Third, interesting to watch the accountability angle. NGOs and the European Parliament have already voiced complaints about transferring powers to the European Commission in this sector. It's seen as a bit too chummy with the defense industry, so that'll be one to watch. And fourth and finally, broadly, strategy. Of course, in order for these industrial measures to strengthen the EU eventually as a defense player, if that's the objective, member states would have to first be able to agree on their interests, their threat assessments, on what type of military operations they want to be able to do. But that's a question for another day, perhaps. So I'll end here. Thanks.
Sophia, thank you very much. An insightful presentation as always, and I'm sure we'll also get a lot of questions for your presentation. But before we get now to the Q&A, we have, last but not least, Dr. Zeno Leoni, a teaching fellow in the Defense Studies Department. For those of you who don't know, he has recently opened a KCL blog and a Twitter account on US affairs with the objective of cultivating the study of US foreign policy and politics at King's. And he told me that everyone is, of course, welcome to join. But first of all, Zeno's presentation. Zeno, please.
Thank you very much, Ben, and please allow me to thank Danny and Lizzie for the support that I had today with the whole infrastructure. So my research area is US-China relations. And if you're interested in US-China relations, especially in US hegemony, you also need to try to understand what's the mood, what's going on between US allies and China nowadays, because as we know, the US hegemony relies quite extensively on a hub and spoke system of alliances. And if there are not alliances, there is not US hegemony. So basically my objective today is trying to make sense of what's happening between the UK and China. But we could sit here and talk about what's happening between Italy, Israel, Australia, and China, for example, or we could look at many other countries. So I want to give you some theoretical references, some empirical points, and some takeaway points. That's the structure of my presentation. So first of all, in terms of theoretical framework, allow me to quote very briefly the Spanish sociologist Manuel Castells. From his point of view, we live in a world structured around, on the one hand, the space of flows, space of capitals, people, ideas, but also viruses, as we discovered. But these flows are not spaceless. They are based upon networks which are linked with specific places, which are the nations, where there are elites who clearly don't want to be overwhelmed, superseded by these flows, but they actually want to control these flows and in order to dominate politically their society and other countries as well. And so I think the rise of China, this is the world we live in, and the rise of China has brought this tension between transnational interests, transnational flows, and sovereign states to the fore. And as David Harvey says, this has created a situation where for the US, but also for the UK, you have to struggle between keeping the world open enough for business on the one hand, while preventing the rise of any grand challenge directly to your state or to the liberal international order. So if you ask me what's happening between the UK and China, I guess this is my answer. The UK, in my view, is trapped within this economy security conundrum. And this is partly because of the special relationship that the UK has with the US, but also because historically the UK as a geopolitical posture of integration, of engagement within the liberal order. What does it mean from an empirical point of view? To me, means that at this stage, China is not driving a wedge between countries so much, but more within countries. So we see a split between different societal interests, and we see pro-China interest and anti-China interest, so to speak. I don't have the time to go through the whole list, but among the with regard to pro-China interest, we see a lot of businesses, the world of finance, different networks of business association, but also the Treasury and the Cameron government, for sure. And in fact, these actors have been quite influential in UK-China relations, to the point that during Cameron's mandate, this relationship went through a golden era, which means that there was a lot of economic integration, but especially China managed to achieve some very important objectives here in the UK. Nonetheless, and this is one of the main points of today's presentation, I think we are at a turning point, at least in the short term, and we might be past the so-called golden era. This is because of the fact that China is challenging rule of law in Hong Kong, in Xinjiang, in the South China Sea, the whole debate on Huawei, and last but not least, and I think this is key, the tensions between US and China on the trade side, but also with regard to COVID, with regard to the battle for truth, the battle of narratives that we've seen with the pandemic outbreak. And this has led to the rise, this has strengthened the position of competing actors in the UK, so the anti-China group, so to speak. And this group is made of a spying agency, probably GCHQ. Michael Gove is an advocate of that, in my view, but also a group of 40 conservative backbenchers. And over the last few days, we've seen also a letter signed by 7 former Secretary of States asking the UK government to be more assertive with regard to rule of law in China. Very importantly, last year there was the Foreign Affairs Committee published a report which to me is at this stage is the most authoritative strategic document with regard to UK-China relations. And this report was very critical about of the Cameron government, but also of the Theresa May government. And I don't think until recently the situation has really changed. The report is asking for a not a tougher stance from a military point of view, but definitely a tougher stance with regard to Huawei and human rights issues, among other things. And I think this is having an impact lately on the Johnson's government. Let me give you some takeaway points so that I remain within the assigned time. What Britain will prevail? What will we see in the future? What will be the Britain's strategy towards China? First of all, UK-China relations are going to provide, end the situation, the whole debate on COVID are going to provide the backdrop to UK-China relations. I think this is key for the time being. And certainly the UK is going to get tougher on China, although not necessarily become anti-Chinese. Nonetheless, it is unlikely, I think, and that would be very unwise, that we will see a binary approach to China. I don't think this is possible. Instead, as the Foreign Affairs Committee suggested, we will probably see a case-by-case approach. This is highly likely, and so we will see a lot of improvisation and muddling through, and certainly until the next national security strategy is out, but apparently this has been delayed by COVID at the moment. We will have to see, this is a relationship, the one between the UK and China, that touches upon every department of the government. So we will have to see in the longer term a whole of government approach. And there will be areas where the UK will not be able to cooperate with China, and areas where the UK will be able to cooperate with China. I guess that's as far as we could go for the time being. But at the moment, the strategy towards China is quite confusing and left to different agencies, different departments, and as you have heard from my presentation, to the parliament as well. Two final thoughts. China is the rise of China, and the debate we're having today is the example of a strategic oversight, a massive one. And this is not only with regard to the UK, we could say the same with regard to the US. Until recently, the UK, some people in the UK government believed that they didn't need a strategy towards China. And here we see a great parallel with COVID-19, I think, where everyone in a way knew about the possibility of that thing happening, of the rise of China or of a pandemic happening, and yet nobody did nothing about it. So I guess that's a key point for strategy makers. Yes, and also a final point I wanted to make, the UK clearly cannot fight against China. It also needs its economic investments. And so I guess what the UK should do, what the UK might do, is to work within multilateral institutions in terms of enforcing rule of law. But again, one might ask whether after Brexit, the UK will still have the same leverage that it used to have. And I'll leave it here. Thank you very much.
Well, Zeno, thank you very much. Another excellent presentation. I think that is going to trigger a lot of questions in the Q&A. We already have, as you might have seen, a lot of questions in the Q&A chat box. And me as chair, I have the difficult task to choose a few of them for you to answer. The first round of questions, I'd like to ask Amelia, because she received a particularly large amount of questions. And Amelia, you received questions that are both kind of specifically about nuclear diplomacy and more generally about broader nuclear issues. And the first question I'd like to ask you is about the nuclear negotiations with Iran. And the question is, now that the US have brokered the Iran nuclear deal and Iran has increased the production of enriched uranium, do you think nuclear diplomacy has reached a point of no return between the P5+1 and Iran? Then we have a more almost technical question regarding the role of the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs and the Security Council. And the question is, how effective is the role of these two institutions in coordinating the cooperation related to nuclear issues that might rise post-COVID-19? And the final question, and you simply might want to choose from them for you, it's an almost philosophical question: is nuclear disarmament possible at all? Amelia, it's your turn.
Sure. Well, I'll start with Iran. Is it a lost cause? Well, no, I'd like to think not. The E3, France, Germany, and the UK are still trying to engage with Iran. Following Trump's withdrawal from the JCPOA, they set up a trading instrument, Instex, to facilitate commercial transactions, to encourage Iran to stay within the nuclear agreement. And in March, for example, that trading agreement instrument concluded its first transaction to facilitate the export of medical goods to Iran to help fight coronavirus. So they're still trying to engage, but obviously the difficulty going forward is how to ensure that Iran stays committed to non-proliferation in the absence of US engagement. And I think that, COVID plays a role in exacerbating that difficulty by preventing diplomatic negotiations. On is disarmament possible? Well, it depends whether you're referring to further nuclear reductions or to complete elimination. Every nuclear weapon state within the NPT has made the commitment to eventually reduce their nuclear arsenals, but there's little prospect, I would say, of this happening in the future. Nuclear weapon states are very firm in their position that the international environment is currently not conducive to complete elimination, and that the international environment has to improve for that to happen. That shouldn't preclude dialogue, but it should reinforce efforts to ensure that deterrence is underpinned by principles of stability and risk reduction. Ben, I'll hand back over to you.
Thank you very much, Amelia. I think you've done a great job in answering these questions, some of them almost being unanswerable, but it's very interesting to hear your views on them. The next question I'd like to put to Duraid, who received a question from an anonymous attendee, and this person points out an interesting contradiction or interesting paradox, if you will. The specific question is that, what we see is that we have an environment that promotes military defense cooperation and military. Well, it says MDC, which I believe is either military defense cooperation or military defense colleges inside Europe. So you have an increasing cooperation within the context you've outlined in defense academies, but at the same time, we live in or at least that's what the person who asked the question believes we live in an increasing area of polarization. So you have these two kind of competing processes as well, increasing cooperation within military education, but at the same time we are as it seems to be an area of polarization, and the person who asked the question basically wants to know how we can understand or explain these competing trends.
Yes, sorry. Are you referring to the less formal education and training programs question?
I don't know. It doesn't say in the chat. The way I understand it is it's more kind of the surprising level of cooperation that we can see in defense colleges, but at the same time we can observe an area of increasing polarization.
So sorry, Ben, I have to apologize. Could you just repeat the question again? I do apologize.
Yeah. I can repeat the specific question, just read it out to you. So the person would like to ask about what security or political environment promoted MDC, which is, I believe, military defense cooperation or military defense colleges inside Europe, or increased roles of defense and security college in an area of polarization, and how can we understand this trend? Or maybe you don't see it that way at all.
No, I think I can see that. I think obviously one of the sort of issues to do with these types of formalized colleges is that they very much do speak to a concept of how to create influence, which is structured around elites. And these are people who are generally within traditional roles of leadership. So, you know, heads of ministries, heads of the armed forces, and so forth. Now, there's a level to which there is increasing emphasis being placed in some colleges, certainly, on bringing in people from more diverse backgrounds, particularly those who have access to some of these levers that are, let's say, catalyzing greater insecurity and greater polarity and so forth. I mean, the obvious one here is, let's say, social media communications and so forth that allow for yes, increasing sort of democratization of discourse, but also the ability to distort that discourse, and in doing so to further that kind of fractionalization, be it international fractionalization, ethnic fractionalization, gender fractionalization, and so forth. I don't think that defense colleges currently have, or can provide the solution to this in terms of the education that they provide. I think that what they can do in this instance is to prepare those leaders who are in traditional positions to be able to respond to those issues with a bit more of a kind of holistic viewpoint, as and when they do start to affect those traditional sort of critical national infrastructures and so forth. So yes, I don't think they're necessarily going to help massively in reducing that increased polarity, but I think they should hopefully help in ensuring that government leaders and some other wider non-governmental leaders are able to take a more holistic approach to responding to those issues.
Great, thank you very much. I think that hopefully answered the question. We'll continue now with questions for Bence. And the first question I have is from Ian Grant, a former law enforcement strategic intelligence analyst. And his point is that that Bence is highlighting the positive progress at sub-regional level. And the question is, what lessons are the southern nations learning from Baltic regional cooperation and vice versa, as Russia and China become increasingly active in the Mediterranean? We have also a more general question in how far the different types of cooperation bands that you've outlined affect NATO, in particular if it affects NATO and NATO cohesion negatively.
Yes.
Yes,
thank you. So it's so different countries are studying each other's cooperation, of course, but it is always most of the time the countries are focusing on their own environment. So the Baltic defense cooperation is a very well-known case, but it was very unique in the sense that the three Baltic states didn't have their own armed forces before the Cold War, because they were part of the Soviet Union, so they had to build their capacities almost from scratch in the 90s. So that the cooperation between them, it was very obvious, and also Western states supported it, and also the Nordic states. So it was a very different dynamic than what is happening in the Mediterranean. I just would like to point out a generic point that defense cooperation is a very good thing, but it is the second best option. So for the military commander, the best option is if it has its own national kind of capabilities. Because if you have to cooperate with other ones, it creates more time and more money to make things work. But sometimes alone, countries cannot provide the capabilities that they need. So in this term, every country and every region has to figure out their own kind of processes and procedures. The Mediterranean countries have a very different kind of culture, military culture, and organizational settings than the Baltic states have. And it is always very crucial how the different organizations fit to each other. So we can see that in the Mediterranean, there was a Spanish-Italian kind of task force created for the battle group rotation. It worked pretty well, but you can take generic points. But as I mentioned, because the different organizational processes, when you start a new cooperation with someone, you have to figure out, again, how things work out. And it is one of the reasons why I said that previous multinational defense cooperation matter, because if you had a previously established defense cooperative framework for something, you already know your partner, and you don't have to start everything from scratch. So you can learn some generic lessons from each other's experiences, but you always have to make sure that you understand the political environment. As I mentioned, the political milieu is very important here, how the political environment and the organizational culture work together or not. And when you make these lessons, you have to figure out if it works. Maybe it worked in the Baltic states for some reasons, but it will not necessarily work for you because you have a different size, different culture, and different history for that. So yes, we can take some lessons, but as I mentioned, you have to make sure that you adapt it to your own environment. And the other question is how, if the different clusters of military cooperation will affect EU-NATO cooperation. I would say no, because what is happening oftentimes that when the EU or NATO nations agree on something on the regional level, on EU or NATO, they oftentimes just are using their already existing defense cooperations and rename it or label it for EU and NATO purposes. For instance, in the early 2010s, there was the NATO Smart Defense Initiative, and it exactly, basically, the idea was that small groupings should work together to create different capabilities. And what happened that the small groupings of nations that have been already working together, they basically said, okay, we are working together already on this. Maybe we can provide this for NATO purposes as well. So I would say that EU and NATO are providing an umbrella for wider cooperation, and I don't see that it would be an either or decision. Either we are working in EU and NATO, or we are working on unilaterally. So countries can decide if they want to work with EU or NATO or in other frameworks. Sometimes it happens that, for instance, the Lancaster House treaties between France and the UK is a bilateral one. In the early 2010s, these two countries decided that, okay, it is best to go bilaterally and not working together with EU and NATO all the time. It might create problems, but the long trend is that at the end, these capabilities that are provided or developed together by different countries, most of the time channeled into EU and NATO initiatives or operations. So thank you. I don't know if is there any questions, Ben?
There are questions still coming in. You've done already a great job answering some of them, and I'm doing whatever I can to kind of put the right questions to the right panelists. But there's just a large amount of questions that we have, and apologies to anyone I haven't been able to include in the questions I put to the panelists. Next, I have a question for Sophia by Anil Singh. And he first points out that EU members tend to operate bilaterally when exporting military hardware and often compete with each other for non-EU contracts. A trend towards consolidation is now evident, at least according to Anil. So he points out TNG with Fincantieri, Atlas Electronic with Kongsberg, and a few more in the offing. And besides, the pan-European programs have had tensions at times, be it the FREM program or the Eurofighter. And the question now is, it's actually quite broad and interesting question. Is the EU likely to have a more effective role in creating a European defense industry for expert and also arming each other's military forces? More effective, I assume, means more effective than individual nation states. Sophia.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So there's a lot in there. I'll try to answer bit by bit. First, maybe on the consolidation point. So The European defense industry has been trying to consolidate, or has had an economic rationale to consolidate since the end of the Cold War. We still deploy 6 times the number of different weapon systems to the US, even though we spent only 40% as much. We have twice as many competitors as in the US. And I do think that industry is likely to see further privatization and consolidation through the EU's directives. There are some signs that the Commission might refer back to the European Court of Justice to try and hold countries to account to actually implement the directives. However, I don't think that the path to consolidation is straightforward. Notably, and in contrast to the US, around a quarter of Europe's top 30 defense companies have large governmental shareholdings. Recent consolidation that we have seen has focused on smaller players with few mega mergers. The point on arms exports, and I touched on that in my presentation very briefly, but I think it's a really important one. If the European Commission is to make defense industrial integration work, there's no way around member states embracing a more joined up arms export policy. Exporting to third countries obviously allows defense companies to enlarge their customer base and creates economies of scale. It also incentivizes European firms to make more competitive products. But I would argue that the success of an instrument such as the European Defence Fund depends on previously agreed, reliable, consistent export policy at the EU level. Otherwise, any future joint armament project runs the risk of falling flat. We've seen what the German decision to ban all exports of even components to Saudi Arabia, I think 2 years ago, had in terms of the effects that that's had. I think member states will only join forces to develop new military equipment or weapon systems if they trust each other to provide the necessary components in times of crisis, both to each other and to customers outside the EU. So with that in mind, will the Commission make defense industrial cooperation more effective? I think it remains to be seen. This is a new field for the Commission. I think that the next budget phase, the next 7 years, are sort of test balloon, perhaps. That's frustrating for anybody who wants to see things that the geopolitical realities would require more forceful defense industrial integration at the EU level sooner than that. But I think in the end, it depends whether the Commission is able to accept advice, accept maybe staff members from the military, if it remains in close touch with industry to see what industry needs. If it's able to, I've had a few Commission officials tell me we just need at the end of these 7 years something that swims or flies or shoots. If it's able to prove its added value through maybe one big ticket capability program where it has contributed to the upfront funding to get through the valley of death, the R&D valley of death, then I think member states might be willing to grant a bit more money in the next budget, which then would allow a greater role for the Commission. So frustrating in the short term, but I think maybe in the long term, we'll see some changes.
Yeah, excellent. Sophia, I was wondering myself how I'd answer that question, but you certainly did a perfect job at answering something where, yeah, at the end of the day, we still don't know. I have now, well, unsurprisingly, perhaps a couple of questions for Zeno. And I think there are 2 big clusters of questions. One is, of course, on Hong Kong, unsurprising because it's in the news, and also more broadly on UK-US relations vis-a-vis the China factor. So we have a question by Emmer about what are the implications of the Chinese intervention in Hong Kong to the Chinese-British relations. And Luke White asks specifically and brings in the US factor here. If the US follows through with revoking the trade status for Hong Kong, how will that impact the future relationship with Hong Kong and China? He asked for your personal opinion, though it would be, I assume, always your personal opinion. Perhaps I should state that none of the panelists represents any institutions on this panel. And finally, and again related to the US factor, Anil asks, if the UK may take a tough stand on China, but China has little, in his opinion, has little respect for the UK and calls it that little dot somewhere in the Atlantic. How will the UK address its relations with China, and will the US be able to influence the UK enough to isolate China? Over to you.
Thank you, Ben. I'll try to touch upon all of these issues, always in a short time. So first of all, I think the US has been influencing the UK on the one end, and we've seen a lot of pressure with regard to the Huawei deal last year, and nonetheless, there was a deal on Huawei, and so that means that the UK is keen on engaging with China, regardless of what the United States might think. So that was an interesting compromise, and I will go back to it. However, I think we are seeing at least in the short term, a shift driven by events in Hong Kong on the one hand, and by the COVID and the fact that this kind of Cold War between the US and China is getting worse and worse. So things are going to change. There is a question from an anonymous speaker. I've seen it on the list. The speaker disagrees with me because he or she thinks that the UK will still be charmed by Chinese money. It might be possible, but I think in the very short term, we'll see a tougher UK towards China. So I think the US will be able to leverage more. In terms of what the UK should do, I have a very simple answer, and maybe easy to say, difficult to apply, but I think the UK should go back to the EU-China strategy, the European Union-China strategy. Back in, it was published in 1995. And the EU, I don't think the EU followed that strategy, but anyway, it's there, it's useful. And I think the UK should make sure that every Chinese company in the country respects international standards with regard to environment and labor. I think that's a very tremendous issue, because China's power comes, first of all, from its economic strategy. And this would also be a non-confrontational way of engaging with China. And in fact, I'm not an advocate, as the Parliamentary Commission said, of adopting a more assertive military stance towards China. In fact, the Commission is asking the government not to do that. So I think ensuring that every business respects that, it's key. And it will have, in the long term, will pay, although there will be a price in the short term. I think another solution might be looking at the Huawei compromise, not as a model, right? So the UK will have to compromise on every single issue. And this is not just a UK view. I mean, this is also a view in the US. If you open Foreign Affairs, April 2020, you find prominent authors advocating for compromise. You see Graham Allison asking for, wondering whether we should actually acknowledge a Chinese sphere of influence in the Western Pacific in exchange for peace, a peaceful relationship between China and Taiwan, for instance. This is just an idea. In terms of Hong Kong, I don't think there is much that the UK can do with regard to what China is doing in Hong Kong. But as I said earlier on, there are multilateral institutions are there for a reason, and that's where the UK should be extremely committed, rather than following the United States of Trump, for example, in this regard. On the other hand, there was a question on the consequences of Trump's decision on Hong Kong with regard to China's Hong Kong relations. I think Trump made a mistake, which will end up isolating Hong Kong. Personally, I see Trump from a strategic point of view as somebody who says a lot of things that make sense from an American point of view, and they are in continuity with the Obama administration. But then from a tactical point of view, the way he operationalizes these kind of objectives sometimes it's kind of irrational and very much driven by his power-driven operational code or worldview. So I think he made a mistake. And I hope I touched upon all the points that were raised in the chat.
Yes, thank you, Zeno. Very, very insightful what you've just said. We still have a couple of questions, and as I said, I'm trying to cluster them as much as possible. And again, apologies for those I might have missed. I'd like to pick up on a question that was asked in the chat. So generally, the chat is not the webinar chat is not the place ideally to put questions. So please use the question and answer chat room if you can, though apparently there have been some technical issues. But there was a question by Jack Taylor for Duraid. Duraid has answered actually the question. It's a very interesting one, but I don't think it went to all the attendees of the seminar. So perhaps Duraid, if that is okay with you, I'll read out Jack's question again, and if you could just kind of repeat in a nutshell what you've put to Jack in the chat to all the attendees. I think that would be really interesting. So Jack asked if Duraid, do you feel that less formal education and training and programs would have a similar positive benefit on stability/security and enhanced civil-military cooperation to that of the formal defense academies? Duraid.
Hi. Yes, as I sort of said to Jack privately, there is definitely a potentially positive impact on these less formal programs. These programs do occur very much on a daily basis. You have open informal collaboration going on, and you find that in private sector conferences, for example, and exhibitions where attendees will be meeting openly. You also have confidential level sort of training programs. That's generally bilaterally, let's say, between two military forces or between a development force and a military force. Now, the benefits of these informal programs, particularly the confidential ones, are that we can look at training officials that have significant influence but aren't necessarily within those typical government channels. So a key one here is tribal leaders within the Middle East who can essentially control sort of large areas, and they would not necessarily be a part of the more formal training systems that we provide. One of the issues here is that you are providing information and training to officials who have less accountability in terms of how they use that information or training. And you aren't able to then coordinate the post-course communications with those officials. And this means it's less easy to then develop those networks in order to gain long-term benefits through defense diplomacy by, asking for a favor here, asking for some information there, gaining human intelligence and so forth. So there are benefits to it, and I certainly think it's something that is worth expanding. There are also downsides. I think it's worth, which I didn't say to Jack, it's worth also caveating this with the fact that with the distribution and the democratization of educational content that is currently out there, there's a level to which a lot of informal learning activities might occur naturally amongst these alternative partners, and they might be getting somewhat biased sources. So I think one significant reason why it's useful to have these informal programs is to, at the very least, make sure that these potential influencers are not gaining a biased perspective due to, Google search algorithms, shall we say.
Yes, Duraid, thank you very much. I should add as well that Duraid has answered a question in the question and answer section by Christopher Pike that asks about specifically defense diplomacy in contrast to the theme of the panel, which is defense and diplomacy, which obviously suggests a certain difference between them. So if you're interested in specifically in defense diplomacy, please have a look at Duraid's answer in the Q&A. And Christopher, thank you for asking that question. We still have very little time, so I thought I use this time for one or two follow-up questions. One is for Ben's, which is fairly specific, and perhaps you can just answer that very briefly. And the question is, when you said in the presentations that quotation, that's now a quotation, persons leading the MDCs, the multilateral defense cooperation, have to like each other. Are we talking about the relevance of individual or group-based interventions aimed at the improvement of interpersonal relationships, common organizational management, or psychology? So if you could perhaps elaborate on that very briefly.
Yeah, thank you. So I think it's a very good point that both organizational management and psychology might play a role. I think, at least in my book, I am focusing on the psychology part of that, because when you study different case studies of defense cooperation, basically you can find those 2 or 3 people who became the engine of creating this cooperation. For instance, in the Lancaster House treaties between UK and France, it was Nicolas Sarkozy and David Cameron who basically had a very good chemistry, and they really wanted to work with each other. They had different reasons why to work with each other, but this chemistry really helped to boost the defense cooperation. And many analysts say that if, for instance, David Cameron and Francois Hollande, the next president, wouldn't be able to start this cooperation. But it happened, similar things happened with the Nordic Defense Cooperation, where the CDSs, the chiefs of defense forces, basically between the Norwegian and the Swedish one, had a very good chemistry, and they had similar visions, and they decided to work together closely, and this was the foundation, the core of the defense cooperation. We can go on and on in Central Europe, where defense policy directors had a very good chemistry. So what happens that it seems that kicking off a defense cooperation, you need people who like to work with each other and have similar goals and visions and ideas and culturally fit together. When the framework and the institution is set, this institution can basically create a path dependency, and the cooperation can work farther, but probably not as fast when the cooperating parties have leaders that like to work with each other. And as I mentioned, it doesn't necessarily have to be at the highest level, but at some level that is relevant for launching the defense cooperation, there should be chemistry between leading personalities. So it is more psychology than organizational management. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. So I think that has clarified that point. So we are quite literally running out of time, and I'd like to put one final, hopefully short, current affairs question to Zeno, and that's then the last point we can address in this panel. It's a question from Mehmet Yüksel about the US proposal to enlarge the G7 to 11 members, and Mehmet would like to know if you have a specific opinion on that.
Yes, so I think thanks for the question, since the Obama administration through the Trump administration, we have seen some attempts at reapproaching Russia. We have seen this with Obama's reset, when Hillary Clinton went to Moscow with that red button, and in a very idiosyncratic manner, as always when it comes to Trump. We've seen that with Trump, with his kind of friendship with Putin. I think there is, and also with regard to the G7 proposal, there is an anti-China strategy there. There is an anti-China logic. So in reverse, we are seeing what we saw during the Cold War when Kissinger tried to approach China in an anti-Soviet, with an anti-Soviet purpose, essentially. I think this is also where we also, I get this feeling also by looking at Trump's latest decision of leaving the Open Skies Arms Control Treaty, and he also said that he may not renew the New START that Obama negotiated with Russia. I think there might be that, but I also think that the Pentagon is still kind of slow reacting to this, and the Pentagon, but also the UK and other European powers are still very much concerned with regard to Russia. So, but there is a trend there for sure. I hope that was clear from. Sorry, I hope I made my point clearly. I think there is a trend where the US wants to focus more on China and is looking for allies.
Perfect, Zeno, and I think that's a very nice final point to make. Yeah, we've, as you've all seen probably, we've come now to the very end of this panel. I obviously don't want to run it longer than necessary. We all aware of Zoom fatigue. So usually at this stage, I would tell the audience, please join me in thanking all the panelists for their presentations, for their excellent answers, for giving us a lot of insights on a wide variety of aspects of defense and diplomacy in a time of crisis, at the time of COVID-19. But unfortunately, within this format, it is not possible, but I'm sure most of the attendees have enjoyed the session. So yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much to the audience for putting a lot of questions. Again, my apologies to those who asked questions and that were not put forward by me to the panelists. It simply wasn't possible to ask all the questions. So yeah, thank you very much, and please join us again as part of the next panels and sessions we have as part of the School of Security Studies Research Conference. And yeah, have a good afternoon. Thank you.